Welcome back to another episode of Version Versus. Last time we looked at Pac-Mania and Tengen's Genesis port, and today, to cap off the arcade Pac-Man marathon, we'll be reviewing Pac-Man Arrangement alongside the PSP reimagining of the same name. Before we get started though, if you enjoy the video, do please leave a like and a comment. It really helps out a ton with all that algorithm stuff. You know how it is. I've also brought a guest along with me today, so introduce yourself, buddy.
I'm the guy from Pac-Land, I'm the Newman from Pac-Land, and I'm here with Mr. the Awest of Beefs to look at the various different iterations of Pac-Man Arrangement. And yeah, there are quite a few different versions.
Thanks for joining me today, Newman. Without further ado, let's get into the review. Pac-Man Arrangement originally released in 1996, nearly a full decade after the last arcade game, Pac-Mania. By this point, the Pac-Man franchise had moved on to home console releases with the likes of Pac-Attack, Pac-Man 2, and Pac-in-Time, and the fifth generation of home consoles were already out. The world had largely moved on from arcades, with the early 90s being the last time any major arcade games had released. All that said, I have to wonder why Namco decided to make this game. It wasn't just Pac-Man either. Namco had remixed a whole bunch of their arcade games under the Arrangement name, including Dig Dug, Mappy, Galaga, Rally X, and more, all bundled into a few different Namco Classic Collection games. Pac-Man Arrangement was included in the second volume, and we'll be referring to this version as Arcade Arrangement throughout the review. As usual, development info on this game is scarce, so I just have to assume this was some kind of initiative by Namco to refresh their older IPs for modern audiences in the late 90s. As for why they stuck to arcade hardware, I can only assume it was because they were still more powerful than even the latest home consoles, but Namco had already been working on games for the PS1 and N64 by this point, so who knows. Either way, it didn't stay arcade exclusive for too long, as ports of this game came out for PS2, GameCube, Xbox, and even GBA in 2001, 5 years after the initial arcade release.
Another 4 years later, the PSP released, and Namco decided to bring back that initiative to refresh their classic games for modern audiences, with a new set of arrangement titles made for Namco Museum Battle Collection. We'll be referring to this version as Arrangement 05. These new arrangement titles featured 3D graphics, new mechanics, and new level designs that practically make them entirely different games from their arcade counterparts. 1 year later, a Japanese exclusive collection released also for the PSP called Namco Museum Volume 2, which came bundled with a slightly altered version of Arrangement 05, including changes to the visuals and music, as well as 4-player multiplayer, as opposed to Arrangement 05's 2-player limit. This version is called Pac-Man Arrangement Plus. Though what's funny is that on the title screen it has another plus symbol, as well as the word plus, so it's more like Arrangement Plus Plus. Since this version is similar to Arrangement 05 though, we'll just be comparing Arcade Arrangement to Arrangement 05, and we'll mention the differences between 05 and Arrangement Plus as they become relevant.
There exists yet another remix of Arrangement called Pac-Man SP Mobile Edition, released for Java flip phones in 2011. This took elements from both the arcade and PSP versions of Arrangement, and honestly looks really cool. Unfortunately, it's never been archived, so as much as I would love to include it in the comparison, I can't exactly do that if I'm not able to play it. Such is the way of many early Japanese mobile games, sadly. In case that wasn't enough, a port of Arrangement 05 to iOS came out also in 2011 under the name Pac-Man Remix. I don't know why Namco kept remixing and re-releasing Arrangement under different names, but god is it confusing. One last thing worth mentioning here is that both arrangements were included in the latest Pac-Man compilation at the time of writing, Pac-Man Museum Plus, with 05 being under the delineation of Pac-Man Arrangement Console version. This is actually a native port with some improved texture work and a higher resolution, so that's what I went with for my Arrangement 05 footage. It does look a bit crusty at times, but I also got native resolution footage from the PSP version for my playthrough of Arrangement Plus, so you guys can see a little bit of both here. With all the introductions out of the way, let's take a closer look at Pac-Man Arrangement.
So, for the story, it doesn't really have one. Like, there are cutscenes, but they're mostly just there to show off a mechanic or something. The arcade version's cutscenes even literally says instructions on them, so it's pretty clear that there was no attempt to tell any kind of story here. At most, you get a pre-final boss cutscene, as well as text after you beat the game, though both are kind of vague, with the ending saying that someone, somewhere, is still being chased by monsters. We do like the ending though. As silly as the wording is, it's super charming. At the end of the day, I sort of see this as one of those open to interpretation sort of games. Like, you can just make up your own sort of story if you wanted to. It could be about the ghost working with Kinky to stop Pac-Man, or something to that effect. Oh, and yeah, there's a new ghost named Kinky. In the Japanese version, their name is Kinzo, but Kinky's a funnier name.
Arrangement 05's approach to cutscenes is pretty much the same, but there's a lot more of them. This version includes a cutscene at the start, at the halfway point, and before the boss of every one of the game's 6 worlds. You can really tell they were running out of mechanics to tutorialize by the end too, as one of the World 6 cutscenes teaches you about this mirror image power-up, after you were required to use it to beat the World 5 boss.
Boy, I sure hope somebody got fired for that blunder.
The cutscenes before each of the bosses have a decent balance of tutorializing the mechanics of the upcoming boss fight and being at least somewhat entertaining to look at, though most of them just amount to Pac-Man running away from the big ghosts, which is kinda lame. World 4's boss doesn't even have an intro cutscene. Even in Arrangement Plus they didn't fix this, it just doesn't get one. The saving grace in either version is that you can skip the cutscenes with the press of a button, though the cutscene skipping happens a lot faster in the arcade version compared to the PSP version, where you have to wait for each cutscene to fade in, skip, and then fade out. Even then, you can't skip these ready cutscenes before each level in the PSP version for some reason, while you could in the arcade game. I know these are small potatoes, but it's a symptom of a larger issue with the PSP version that we'll get more into as the review goes on. While Arrangement 05 is often slower with its cutscenes, taking longer to skip them and sometimes not letting you skip them at all, it also at least tries a little harder, having a lot more of them, so there's not really enough difference for me to give out any points here. Pac-Man Arrangement on arcades has got to be one of the prettiest looking games in this entire series. Its vibrant color palette, fluid animation, and gorgeous sprite work make for a very visually appealing game. What makes this incredible art style even more impressive is that this game still runs at the same 224x288 resolution as the original Pac-Man from 1980, but the hardware has improved so much that they can have these beautifully detailed sprites and tons of different animation frames to give everything a really eye-catching look. I love the way the Pac Dots dance around, the way Pac-Man and the ghosts bounce up and down ever so slightly as they move around the maze, Kinky's fluid transforming animation, the particle effects, the unique level themes, the text. Look at that text, it's beautiful. Big bold letters with a solid gradient and the letters bounce in and out of view with this cool effect. I love it. We are far past the days of the neon outlined walls on a black background. As cool as that looked in 1980, Arrangement feels like such a natural progression of the series' visuals with more interesting and varied settings. You start off with this blocky toy box world, which is super colorful, and then you get a reimagining of the original game's maze with added shading, brighter lighting in higher up areas, and support beams holding the stage up from below. World 2 is water themed with mossy walls and stone ruins, and World 3 looks like a hedge maze. There's an Egyptian theme for World 4 and a factory theme for World 5, and they've both got such incredible detail in the sprite work. I know I keep saying that, but man, I can't get over just how good the art in this game is. Even the fruits are at their best, with higher fidelity sprites for the classics and a whole bunch of new ones, like mushrooms, grapes, eggplants, and even a padlock to go with the classic key. Speaking of which, this new sprite for the key looks more like the design from Pac-Land, which I'm not a huge fan of. Since I don't really know where else to bring this up though, I do want to mention this strange glitch I encountered at the end of the last level where the ghost did some kind of action on the same frame that I ate the last dot, and the game froze for about 6 seconds before finally fixing itself and moving me on to the next level. It was a little scary at first. I thought I was going to have to replay the entire game because of a hard lock right before the final boss, but thankfully it wasn't a serious problem at all. If that and a small nitpick over one sprite is the worst I can say about this game's visuals, you know they've done a real good job with this one.
Yes, I quite concur. Arrangement Arcade's art style is lovely, with its greatly detailed sprites and its bouncy and fluid animation. It's one of those art styles that even goes as far as to elevate gameplay. Arrangement 05, on the other hand, well, at most it's alright, I guess. But when compared to the pure artistry of Arrangement Arcade, it really lacks. Of course, it is understandable why this is the case. With the newer hardware, it does prompt the jump to 3D visuals. It's just that with these visuals, a lot of the charm gets lost in translation. It looks cheap and plasticky. There's little to no use of squash and stretch, and the animations and models all just look stiff. The colors are vibrant, similar to the arcade version, but they lack the contrast present in the arcade version, since the backgrounds are just as bright and colorful as the foreground. This lack of contrast makes it all feel very samey. Arrangement Arcade had that mix of light and dark. Here, it's all too bright. This also leads into the game's level theming. Each world is split up into 2 halves, with a slight variation on a common theme. The exception is the first world, which starts in a maze design similar to the original Pac-Man, and then switches to a design inspired by the Toy Box world from Arcade Arrangement. There's an outdoor park, high-rise building, factory world, and the Spooky Mansion, a classic theme for Pac-Man games. I will say that this attempt to split up and diversify level themes can help to add variety, like how World 5 transitions from an above-water pier to an underwater coral reef. However, it often comes off as redundant when so much of the game retains the same color palette, aside from maybe the final world. If anything, it's sometimes hard to tell what one specific locale is supposed to be because of certain details they try to implement, or lack thereof. World 3 can be confusing because it's a skyscraper, but with pipes on the inside. 3-2 has it next to an ocean, I guess, so it's a factory skyscraper water level? But then the next world is the actual factory/construction site world. Like, I'm all for mixing level themes, but this comes off as redundant. I do like the look of the overworld map though.
To be honest, it's kind of ugly looking, at least in Museum Plus. They redrew it for this port, and the way that colors blend together looks gross. Of course, in the original resolution, it looks much better, as you can see here in my Arrangement Plus footage. Speaking of which, one of the big changes Arrangement Plus made were to the level themes. For example, the levels based on the original Pac-Man are now themed around Miss Pac-Man, with the maze walls being colored in and bows added to the tunnels and the Pac-Man sprites in the corner background textures. I can see now why this version wasn't included in Pac-Man Museum Plus, though they did seemingly forget to edit Miss Pac out of the credits in this port anyway.
Boy, I sure hope somebody got fired for that blunder.
The new themes are all based on existing Namco properties, like World 2's new theme is based on Tank Battalion, World 3's is Mappy themed, World 4's is Toy Pop themed, World 5 is oddly enough themed on Dig Dug 2 with the posts and splits in the ground, and World 6 is themed around Tower of Druaga, which fits in surprisingly well with the Haunted Mansion aesthetic. Despite changing the themes for half of each world, they still managed to fit in with their counterparts for each world, like the pier in World 5 was replaced with the Dig Dug 2 visuals, but then the second half of World 5 is the underwater coral reef. So I like to imagine the island you were on in the previous stages got sunken just like in Dig Dug 2. The Mappy theme fits perfectly in a high-rise building too, since that game originally took place in a very tall building. The Toy Pop world is kind of a weird replacement for a construction site, but I think it still manages to pair nicely with the factory when you think of it as like further down the production chain in a toy factory. I really like these new themes. They add some fun variety to Arrangement 05's visuals without taking away from the consistent theming it had going on for each world. On top of that, it fills the game with references to Namco's other arcade classics that put a big smile on my face each time I notice them. Still though, it's just as lacking in charm when it comes to models and animations as Arrangement 05 was, so I think Arcade Arrangement is still the better looking game overall. In 05's defense, the game looks leagues better at the original 480 by 272 resolution that it was made for, where the tiling is less obvious and the chunkiness of the models are hidden by the low resolution. Before I give out any points, I want to clarify that in the case of the PSP game, I'll be combining aspects of both Arrangement 05 and Arrangement Plus to give it a fighting chance and to give credit where it's due. That said, I do appreciate the visuals more when taking Arrangement Plus into consideration, so I'll give the arcade version 2 points for the better art style. Arrangement Plus's new themes save it from being down 3 points. I do quite like those.
Arcade Arrangement's sound design is incredible. The sound effects have that crunchy yet smooth sound that's just oh so good to listen to. The sounds of Pac-Dot munching, the almost laser-like whoosh sound when you go through a dash panel, the noises and giggles the ghosts make, the power pellet sounds, and the smooth chomp when you eat a ghost. Oh, and the extra life sound effect. That's also pretty good. It's hard to exactly put into words. I guess it's really just the impressive quality of the sounds. It creates an otherworldly feel to it. The same goes for the soundtrack. It's among the best OSTs in the series, with how soulful and transcending it all sounds. You have the upbeat World Zero theme, the incredible catchy World 1 theme, the intense World 5 tune. The soul-purifying round clear music. A big part of this has to do with the improved arcade hardware, which allows the game to sound damn good as it does. Every sound, every song is ingrained into my consciousness. With Arrangement 05, I can't really say the same in that game's regard, but it's alright, I suppose.
While Arcade Arrangement goes out of its way to progress the sounds of the Pac-Man series with new takes on classic sound effects and plenty of its own unique additions, Arrangement 05 is content to reuse the same tired old sound effects from 1980 that the franchise had become fond of spamming in every game at the time for the sake of retro appeal. Don't get me wrong, those classic sound effects are great. I praised the sound design in my review of the original game for a reason, but after hearing them so many times, you get a similar problem to Sonic in Green Hill Zone. Too much of a good thing can get stale and tiring after a while. It wouldn't be so bad if Arrangement 05 had at least bothered to bring some quality original sound effects and music mixed in with the classics, but everything here is understated and forgettable. The music is overly synthy, and that's coming from someone who likes Sonic Force's soundtrack. Yes, even the classic Sonic level themes. Arrangement 05's soundtrack is overly bubbly and plucky with its instrumentation, and the compositions just aren't that interesting. The boss theme in particular is really repetitive and annoying. World 5 is probably the best song in the game thanks to the less annoying instrumentation, but even that song is pretty repetitive. At best, the music in this game is okay, and at worst, it can be kind of annoying at times. A lot of it just blends together and sounds really samey. Compare that to Arcade Arrangement's varied instrumentation and compositions for each song, and it's night and day. Fortunately, Arrangement Plus comes to the rescue once again with some pretty solid remixes. To pair with the new level themes based on existing Namco arcade games, they included remixes of those games' themes, and they're all pretty good. The Miss Pac-Man remix has this really cool ambience to it with echoing synths and a funky bass, and this bridge with the guitar and organ are really neat. The Dig Dug 2 rock remix with electric guitars is pretty bangin'. And the Toy Pop remix has some really neat percussion. My biggest complaint with these remixes is that the loops are woefully short, about 30 seconds to a minute each. The Mappy remix is unfortunately missing the second half of the original song, and is generally way too echoey. These remixes don't replace any of Arrangement 05's music either, since they only play in one half of each world, so if you did like the original soundtrack, it's still entirely here and accounted for. With the nice remixes from Arrangement Plus in mind, I'll give the arcade version another 2 points for the better music and way better sound effects. Pac-Man Arrangement introduced quite a few new mechanics to spice things up for this reimagining of the genre. First of all, there are some new elements to the levels, like dash pads and jump pads. The former giving you a burst of speed able to make any ghosts you pass through dizzy, and the latter warping you from one section of the maze to another. I love how you can keep the dashpad's speed boost going across multiple turns if you time your inputs correctly, but if you don't, you'll bonk and lose the speed boost completely. Since the dashpads are single use, this adds an element of risk and reward that I really appreciate. The jump pads give you some invincibility frames too, so you won't get caught by a ghost as soon as you warp over, which is also appreciated. Another big addition is differently sized pack dots. Larger dots take longer for Pac-Man to eat, and so they slow you down more, giving ghosts a chance to catch up to you. This mechanic is ripped straight from Junior Pac-Man, but with 3 different dot sizes instead of just 2. Sometimes the dots will pulse their size up and down in a wave that looks really cool. The next big new addition is the power-ups. After eating a number of ghosts, a pill will spawn in the bottom center section of the maze, giving you a different ability depending on the color. Red pills make you run faster, pink pills warp all the ghosts back to the ghost cage and trap them there momentarily, orange pills let you run through the larger pack dots without slowing down, and my favorite, the blue pill, gives you a temporary mirrored Pac-Man that lets you chomp through both halves of the maze at the same time. This one is so satisfying to use effectively, letting you blaze through levels at double the speed. There's also a yellow pill, but all it does is give you 100 points. That's it. No bonus effect at all. There's also a brown pot power-up, which I didn't actually encounter at all in either of my 2 recorded playthroughs, but it just does the exact same thing as the pink pill. I'm not really sure why this is here. The magic wand is a bit more interesting, turning all the ghosts into presents, which give you 1,000 points each when you eat them. There's also a super rare chance of an extra life spawning here, which is pretty neat. The cool thing about the colored pills is that you can actually manipulate them to spawn specific ones if you know what you're doing. They correspond to which ghost you ate and in which order, and the powers they give you tie into the abilities of their respective ghosts. That brings us to Kinky. True to his name, he combines with the other ghosts to power them up, which gives them bigger sprites and new abilities to make Pac-Man's life harder. We'll get more into the specifics of these abilities later though. Finally, multiplayer has been revamped for this game. Taking a page from Tengen Miss Pac-Man's book, Pac-Man Arrangement includes a simultaneous multiplayer mode. In this game, however, the second player controls a green-colored Pac-Man, rather than Miss Pac-Man or something like that. It's kinda lame, but I also like the green Pac-Man a bit, so whatever. Also, you can go straight through each other rather than bumping off of each other, which is way better for the game flow. This is hands down the best multiplayer in the entire series. It does make the game a little bit too easy, cutting down playtime from about 20 minutes in my solo run to less than 15 when we played together.
And that was with me dealing with some pretty bad input delay playing over Parsec.
Even then, it was still a fun time, and I've played through this game in a multiplayer when having friends over many times. It's always a guaranteed good time. Honestly, blazing through each maze super fast by splitting the work in half between 2 players is super satisfying and makes the game way more fun. It even has a competitive aspect, tallying up wins based on who got the most points in each level, but I tend to ignore this and just play the game cooperatively.
So yeah, Arrangement Arcade does a good job expanding the maze formula and has a great flow to its gameplay, with Kinky adding a significant amount of depth and strategy with his transformations, the inclusion of stage mechanics like dash pads, jump pads, and stairs, as well as the various power-ups. Now, what happens if you take away Kinky and the cool stuff he adds, most of the power-ups, and make it slower with some added annoyances? Well, you get Arrangement 05. One of the biggest omissions is Kinky and his transformations. That was the defining aspect of Arcade Arrangement's gameplay, and to remove it takes away a whole lot of the strategy and complexity that comes with Arrangement. At that point, it's an entirely different game. It would be one thing if the game managed to have something of its own to make it interesting to help stand out, but this game chooses to remove elements rather than to add. That's not all that Arrangement 05 removed though. Like large dots and most of the power-ups, the one that remains is the mirror pellet. Now, taken the form of a scroll. It's the best one, so they made the right choice to keep it, but that doesn't mean jack pack when it barely ever shows up. It doesn't show up more than a couple of times until the penultimate world. It is cleverly used in a boss, but we'll get into that later. As for the new power-ups, we have a crappy bootlegged Reveral that takes forever to charge. Imagine if in the world games, the Reveral took this long to charge and use. It would be tedious as hell. What's funny is that it both makes the game even more effortless, while also being useless. Like, how? There's the jump power-up, which is a thing. I don't even recall if it lets you jump over ghosts. It's mostly used for a boss fight. Even then, it's quite situational at best. Though we both find the present power-up, which turns every regular pack dot into a power pellet, to be quite amusing. But there really isn't much more to it. Compare this to the power-ups in Arcade, which had actual uses and, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, added to the strategy. There's no strategy here. They're just lame. It's really telling that the only good one happens to be the only one ripped straight from the original. The only thing Arrangement 05 actually adds are pace-breaking gates, like these doors in World 2, the elevators in World 3, the conveyor belts in World 4, and the bridges in World 5. All these serve the same purpose, to make you wait around for a thing to move or open. World 6 has every single one of these to make for the ultimate test of patience. You know, having come out in 2005, both this and Pac-Man World 3 sure love to make you wait around. As if that wasn't bad enough, they took their returning gimmicks from Arcade Arrangement and made them worse too. The jump pads take way longer, and the dash pads aren't necessarily bad, but feel more stiff and less impactful, probably due to the game's overall lifeless feel. The only other thing worth mentioning here is the multiplayer, which is simultaneous like the arcade game, but actually uses Miss Pac-Man instead of Green Pac-Man. We don't have any footage of this since the multiplayer was removed from Pac-Man Museum Plus, for obvious reasons. For what it's worth though, Arrangement Plus did increase the number of players from 2 to 4, bringing back Junior and Baby.
Arcade Arrangement gets 3 points for having more power-ups with fun use cases and less waiting around for slow-moving platforms. I'll be generous and give the PSP game 1 point for Arrangement Plus's 4-player multiplayer mode, which is more than the arcade version had, even though it's locked to a Japanese exclusive version that I'm not even able to actually play.
Boy, Arrangement Plus must have some back problems for having to constantly carry Arrangement 05. Moving on to the Ghost AI, it's mostly copied over from the original game, the big exception being the new ghost Kinky, and his ability to transform the other ghosts. Kinky himself has a certain limit to how many times he can respawn per level. In the first 2 worlds, he's limited to 1 respawn, so if you eat him twice, he'll be gone for the rest of the level. As the game goes on, that respawn limit increases to 3 times in World 2, 5 times in World 3, and 7 for the rest of the game. His transformations are also limited once in World 0 and 1, twice in World 2, 3 times in World 3, and 4 for the rest of the game. But even in the late game, levels won't usually last long enough for this to happen, unless you're like me who chokes at this point in the game. Side note, Blinky and Clyde's names get switched up in this game, so when we say Clyde, we're referring to the red ghost, and when we say Blinky, we're referring to the orange ghost. Anyway, Clyde's power-up state gives him the ability to dash in a straight line towards Pac-Man, Pinky's lets her jump straight to Pac-Man from anywhere else on the map, Inky gives a mirrored version on the other side of the maze, and Blinky lets him drop extra dots randomly around the maze, which can be really annoying. To balance out Kinky's transformation ability, he's in a constant state of vulnerability, and when you chomp him, it acts like an extra power pellet, turning all the other ghosts blue too, albeit with a shorter timer than usual. As you can imagine, this gives you a lot of options in the playing field. You can try and prevent the transformations by eating Kinky. Properly positioning yourself when you chomp Kinky can benefit not only from making things safer for you, but also pulling off ghost chains. However, while allowing transformations to happen can make the game a bit harder, especially with Blinky and Inky, it also has the added advantage of netting you extra points, as transformed ghosts are worth double the points, and with the amount of transformed ghosts in later stages, you can get combos of 7,650, though that's much easier said than done.
Arrangement 05, however, doesn't include any of this. Like we said earlier, Kinky and the ghost transformations are all completely gone. That's Arcade Arrangement's core gimmick, just completely taken out of this version. All the strategy and tension these elements brought to the arcade game are gone, and all we're left with are the 4 ghosts slowly wandering around the maze, barely posing a threat. I even set the difficulty to hard in my 05 playthrough, and it was still piss easy. The only time they'll give you any trouble is when the levels funnel them into an area where they can easily corner you, or if you get screwed over by their huge hitboxes. They at least move around in the same way they did in the original Pac-Man, but that's not really saying much when half of the levels are so gimmicky that they end up in completely random spots anyway. These level layouts can make it a real pain in the ass to get around the ghosts sometimes too, and it's super annoying, like the bottom section of 4-1, where the ghosts pile up and block your access to the power pellet, forcing you to sneak into the dash pad to get through them. The ghost AI in this game isn't necessarily bad or anything, it just doesn't really match the level design and is missing the arcade version's central element. It wouldn't be so bad if it at least had something unique to call its own, but it just doesn't. Arcade Arrangement gets 3 points for having Kinky and the ghost transformations, a really fantastic addition to the maze formula that spices things up without feeling out of place. That brings us to the level design, quite possibly the most important aspect of any Pac-Man maze game. Badly designed mazes can completely break even the best maze games, but well-designed mazes are what elevate them to greatness. I've talked at length throughout this marathon about the importance of crafting mazes with good balance and flow, and explaining where these games have succeeded and failed at doing so. I'm happy to report then that Arcade Arrangement has some of the best in the series. It's not perfect, but with 22 unique levels, I can't really expect it to be. That said, 22 unique levels is a bit too much for me to do my typical color-coded graphics on, and the PSP version's got another 24, so that's just not happening. Sorry, folks. I can, however, examine the philosophy behind the level design to explain what makes it work so well, and in turn, see how Arrangement 05 compares. Pac-Man Arrangement takes cues from Super Pac-Man, and then it focuses on keeping the player in a constant flow state. Unlike that game, however, it applies this design to something more akin to the original game, with straightforward mazes full of dots and plenty of turns to afford the player enough escape routes. Many mazes in this game will lay the dots out in such a way that you can take a straight line path through the entire maze with very little backtracking, which pairs really nicely with the game's quick pace and fast cornering. The cornering in this game is so satisfying. With good timing, you can swerve through corners with a swift pace, and it feels really nice. It's so powerful that I even managed to corner through a ghost once. This helps to make for a really satisfying run through the more linear mazes and some really tight dodges away from the ghosts, especially when they're powered up. Some mazes have a more grid-like structure though, often featuring dash panels to help you navigate through them easier. These are usually my least favorite stages since they often have the most backtracking, and finding an optimal route can be difficult when thinking on the fly. They're far from bad mazes, but they are just the slightest bit tedious at times. Most mazes, however, will look pretty standard, often including some extra elements like jump pads to segment different areas of the maze, or stairs to add elevation to the design. It's a small thing, but the elevation gives these levels a sense of literal depth that even Pac-Mania's mazes didn't have. It is kind of annoying that you can't 180 while on stairs, but the stairs are never more than like 2 tiles long anyway, so it's not a huge deal. I always took for granted just how well designed this game's mazes are until I sat down to analyze them more closely for this review, and yeah, they're really great. They're fairly large, but not overbearing. Gimmicky, but not in a way that ever breaks the flow of the game. Challenging when it needs to be, but always still fair with lots of options at every turn to make the game balanced. You're always in control, and so long as you plan ahead well and have good reaction time, there should always be a good escape route if the ghosts get too close, but it's up to you to make the correct decision while under pressure. This game's balance is incredibly fine-tuned in such a way that it's challenging enough to be fun, but still has a high skill ceiling for advanced players, making it a really satisfying game to replay over and over. I groaned at having to record a second full playthrough of the PSP game with Arrangement Plus, but was eager to play Arcade Arrangement a second time for the multiplayer footage. That's just how fun and addicting this game is. Just thinking about it as I write this is making me want to go play through it again. That replay value is amplified by its short length. This is a game with 22 unique levels, a final boss, and an ending, and it all wraps up in less than 20 minutes. I could open this game up and give it a full playthrough at quite literally any time thanks to its short length, and I go back to it fairly often because of how fun and satisfying it is. Pac-Man Arrangement is a game all about flow and balance, giving the player the options necessary to fly through the game at their own pace while still posing a challenge to those who aren't paying close enough attention. It can be pretty easy to get tunnel vision while playing this game, so the ghosts catch me off guard quite a lot, but it's never that big of a deal thanks to this game's generous continue system. Once you run out of lives, just pop in another quarter and you're right back where you left off. You don't even have to restart the level, you keep your progress, even in single player. While this does make the game quite a bit easier and lowers the tension somewhat, I do appreciate how it keeps the pace up and lets you get right back to that flow state. Overall, Arcade Arrangement is an incredibly well-designed game that practically perfected the maze game formula.
Once again, what was pretty great in Arrangement Arcade is made severely worse and dumbed down in Arrangement 05. The level design does attempt to go for a similar flow, level design wise, with the earlier levels being doable by following the Pac-Dot trails, but it's way less fun here simply because the game's flow. Again, it's much slower, and the cornering is non-existent. Most importantly, the levels are designed for a 16:9 display, which leads to a wider playfield as opposed to Arcade's vertical design. This doesn't flow well with the approach. The levels go on for far too long, and the slower speed makes these levels drag on, with corridors that tend to go on for far too long. 4-2 has the worst example of this, with a long narrow hallway cut off on both sides by the ghost cage. so you're pretty much guaranteed to die at least once up here. And to reiterate what we mentioned before, the game also incorporates level gimmicks that only serve to slow the game further down, with the jump pads, overly long animation, and the many gates, like the elevators, conveyor belts, doors, and bridges that make you wait around for them to move or open. It doesn't help that this is Pac-Man, where you have to constantly be on the move, and stuff like these stops make it easier for ghosts to unfairly catch up to you. It basically commits the biggest Pac-Man maze design sin of having dead ends, with these stop and go points being temporary dead ends, but I guess it's better than actual dead ends. Oh, wait a minute. To be fair, the dead ends here have dash pads, jump pads, or power pellets to compensate, and they're usually pretty short. The one exception to this is the last level, but even then, there's nothing there, so you don't have to go there. But on the flip side, this happened. That is some rude game design. Still though, why even have dead ends to begin with? They're not that bad, but having them here at all comes off as amateurish. I will admit, there are some levels that do flow well enough, such as 2-4, which has these dash pads at the beginning of corridors that take you along the quickest path of Pac Dots. On one hand, this is practically Sonic Forces tier automation, but it's the one part of the game that actually has a nice sense of flow to it, so it registers as being fun, compared to other levels where you have to sit and wait around, and are always at the risk of getting marked. The risk is compounded by Arrangement 05's continue system. At the very least, it has a continue system, but it's still worse than the arcade versions, forcing you to restart the entire level. This isn't that bad, but when most of your deaths are bullshit anyway, it kinda sucks. Also, backtracking is bothersome. For example, these cross-sections on the top of 3-3 create this flow of forcing you to go back and forth. There isn't a whole lot of this, but there's just enough for it to be pretty damn annoying. Overall, Arrangement 05's level design doesn't really have anything going for it, sapping out all the fun from the arcade game and replacing it with the hallmarks of bad Pac-Man maze design. It's really not that bad, despite all of our complaints, but when compared to the arcade version's excellent maze design, it really pales in comparison.
I'd have to agree completely. Arrangement 05 just feels like a lesser experience in pretty much every aspect. Unfortunately, Arrangement Plus doesn't do anything to attempt to fix this either. Almost all of its changes are purely cosmetic. No new level design or anything like that. In all fairness, Arrangement 05's level design isn't terrible or anything, it's just mediocre with a few splashes of bad design here and there that bring it down. On the other hand, the arcade version's level design is practically perfect, giving me very little to complain about. So, I'll be giving Arcade Arrangement 4 points for having significantly better level design.
That just leaves us with the bosses, which was a fairly new concept for a Pac-Man maze game, at least in the arcade version. When you look at a Pac-Man maze game, you may wonder how the hell a boss fight would work in one, but many have attempted, and some are better than others. With Arrangement being their first time, they did it pretty well. At least it's miles better than Championship Edition 2's approach, though at the same time, it could be better in certain areas. The first phase has you avoiding these clones of the main 4 ghosts, but the boss takes place in a grid-like maze, which honestly makes it a bit too difficult for what should be the first phase of the fight. Either the maze design could have been tweaked, or the ghost AI could have been tweaked around the maze design. The second phase is pretty fun, with the ghost mech chasing you as you eat these green Pac Dots that turn into bullets that fire back at the mech. The third phase has the boss go into a desperation berserk mode that becomes more intense and tricky, and I quite like how crazy it gets here. It concludes with you hitting this Pac-Man icon that flashes green, prompting the summoning of these hammers that wreck the mech. Overall, it's a little rough in some areas, but I like how hectic it can be, and it can be quite satisfying to fight. It's a nice way of wrapping up Arrangement Arcade.
Personally, I'd say that the final boss is actually my least favorite part of the arcade game. I do like how hectic it can be, but it can quickly become overwhelming and it always kicks my ass. It's not bad or anything, just not really my favorite part. Arrangement 05's bosses are pretty mixed though. For one, this game actually has 6 different bosses, though they all play out in mostly the same manner. You eat power pellets to split the giant ghosts up into several smaller ghosts, eat as many as you can before the power pellet runs out, grab another one, and rinse and repeat until you've eaten all the ghosts. This is fine enough on paper, and I'd even say is conceptually better than what the arcade game did, but there are unfortunately some issues holding them back. For one, if you happen to grab a power pellet after the ghosts are no longer blue, but before they fully reassembled into the giant ghost, you just wasted that power pellet. That may not sound like too big a deal, but it leads me to my second complaint. The power pellets take way too long to respawn. A lot of times you'll end up sitting around and running in circles, dodging the ghost's very basic attacks for what feels like forever, just waiting for the power pellets to come back. This is at its worst in the second and fourth boss fights, which only have 2 power pellets. It's basically impossible to 2-cycle any of the bosses, and even a 3-cycle is pretty unlikely, so you're pretty much guaranteed to have to wait around for both power pellets to respawn in these fights. Some of the bosses also leave their machines sitting wherever they were when you grabbed the power pellet, so they'll either block your visibility or just straight up make an entire portion of the arena inaccessible, often allowing the ghosts to camp behind it, which can be really annoying. These issues often add up to make for some pretty tedious boss fights, but they're not all bad. The first boss is pretty simple and straightforward, not having any gimmicks getting in the way, and the World 5 boss is probably my favorite fight across either game, making good use of the mirror power-up and placing the power pellets on the side where your mirror goes, which is pretty cool. Oddly enough, this fight is the only place in the entire game where there's any level design change in Arrangement Plus, which adds a 4th power pellet and moves the center one over to the right side corner. I'm not really sure why they bothered adding a power pellet to this fight when it didn't really need it, but didn't add any to the bosses that only had 2 to begin with. Well, as it turns out, this difference doesn't actually come from Arrangement Plus. I just happened to notice it in my Arrangement Plus playthrough because I played that version on normal difficulty. If you play on easy mode, you get more power pellets in the bosses, which kind of renders my complaints about the Pinky and Clyde bosses moot. Normal and hard mode are mostly the same, with the exception of normal having 4 power pellets in the World 5 boss as opposed to hard mode's 3. While the bosses in Arrangement 05 are mostly hit or miss, I think the better concept and a couple pretty good fights balances out the annoyances, and in my opinion is just enough to warrant a point for the PSP version.
Yeah, I certainly agree with your critiques of the bosses, but I do like what they attempt. Maybe they would work better if either the power pellets respawned more frequently, or the bosses had more interesting attacks that kept you on your toes and warranted the waiting. World 5's boss is definitely the best, but I also kinda personally like the final boss, for how it can keep the action going even when you have a power pellet.
That concludes our review of Pac-Man Arrangement, and really, what else is there to say about this maze game masterpiece? Arcade Arrangement not only perfects the level design with an understanding of what makes for truly high-quality mazes, but adds unique ideas of its own to the formula, with different elevations and jump pads. It not only uses the classic Pac-Man Ghost AI that I've consistently praised throughout this marathon, but adds a new ghost that changes what you thought you knew about these ghosts by transforming them and giving them new abilities. Not content to stop there, Arrangement adds in a slew of new power-ups that keeps each level fresh. It's got some of the best visuals I've seen in a Pac-Man game, with gorgeous sprite work and fluid animation, as well as an excellent pack of sound effects and pretty memorable music. Most importantly though, Arrangement brings back the fast-paced flow of Super Pac-Man, which I have sorely missed in the reviews since. This constant sense of speed makes for an incredibly satisfying and endlessly replayable experience, and thanks to that, Arcade Arrangement is one of my favorite games in the entire franchise.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. Arrangement took the maze formula and made the best game possible with it. Incredible art direction, fast-paced, fun gameplay, with greater options thanks to Kinky, and with its perfect length and high skill ceiling, it might be the Pac-Man game I've revisited the most.
On the other hand, however, you have Arrangement 05. This game seemingly learned none of the lessons taught by the game which bears its namesake. The pretty visuals have been replaced with boring-looking 3D models and stiff animations, the iconic sounds and music were replaced with this generic-sounding synthy crap, and the tightly paced level design has been stretched out to fill a widescreen display, with very little care taken to avoid the pitfalls of Pac-Man maze design. On top of that, several of the arcade version's best additions were completely removed, including several power-ups, as well as Kinky and his ghost transformations. What really kills this game for me, though, is how they wiped out any sense of flow, instead filling the game with pace-breaking gimmicks in every level, and slowing down the ones it borrows from the arcade game. The biggest positive I can attribute to this game is that they at least tried a little harder with the bosses, but even those run into some issues that can make them tedious and annoying at times. Arrangement Plus helps things out quite a bit, with generic level themes and music being replaced by remixes of old Namco arcade games, and those are genuinely pretty charming. The expanded 4-player multiplayer is also a nice addition, even if I'll probably never be able to actually play it myself. Overall, while it's not a bad game per se, carrying the Pac-Man arrangement name only sets this game up for failure. If it had a different name and I were reviewing this game on its own later down the line, my criticisms would still apply, but I'd at least be more inclined to go easier on it. Comparing itself to one of the best games in the series is really not doing it any favors. This game is mediocre, but in comparison to the arcade game, it's a disaster.
At its best, it's just alright, but most of the time, it's really mediocre, and it becomes outright embarrassing when taking into account its namesake. But ignoring the namesake and looking at what it does as a Pac-Man maze game, it still doesn't work. It suffers from many amateuristic and honestly bad design choices. It's not outright terrible, though really it's just mediocre. There are far worse games in the series, but there are also way better games you could be playing.
Like, you know, the one it's named after?
Hell! Even going further with this, the maze minigame of Pac-Man World 3 is also based off of Arrangement Arcade. Granted, it's a stripped down version of Arrangement Arcade, with it missing Kinky, and just like Arrangement 05, it looks pretty stiff, but I can forgive those things in part due to it being a smaller section of a bigger game. Hell, it's impressive how this minigame not only replicates most of Arrangement's philosophy, but manages to do so better than Arrangement 05, using the power-ups that game scrapped, as well as having a better flow to it. So yeah, I guess that's all I have to say. It's Pac-Man Arrangement 2005. Pac-Man Arrangement, but run through Google Translate. Thanks for having me on, ahbeef. It's been a pleasure, and until next time, I will see you all later.
And so that brings us to our version versus winner, the arcade version. Obviously. I mean, this matchup was over before it even started. Honestly, I'm surprised 05 got any points at all, but there are a few glimmers of good design in there. Mostly just the additions from Arrangement Plus. I do really like those. But yeah, the arcade version wins by a landslide. We might not see a difference this big for a while. Thanks for watching, and big thanks to Newman for joining me on this review. It was a ton of fun finally doing a collab again. Go check out his channel, especially if you're a Pac-Man fan like we are. Big thanks to all my patrons as well. If you'd like to support me financially, consider donating to my Patreon, link in the description. I'll see you all in the next one for a long overdue video.